December 18th, 1944. In the forests east of St. Vith, Belgium, a German corporal named Hans Müller moved through snow that came up past his boots. He hadn't eaten real food in 3 days. None of them had. The attack had started 2 days earlier. Hitler called it Walked on Rhine, Watch on the Rhine. The generals called it their last chance. The soldiers just called it cold. They pushed west through the Ardennes, hitting American lines that weren't ready, weren't dug in, weren't expecting anything. For the first time in months, the Germans were winning again. But winning didn't mean eating. Hans walked with 12 other men from his company. They moved slowly, not because of caution, but because their legs didn't work right anymore. Hunger did that. It made you slow. It made your hands shake. It made the world feel far away, like you were watching yourself from somewhere else. Behind them, the sound of artillery rolled through the trees. Ahead, nothing, just white hills and frozen roads, and the kind of silence that made you think maybe the Americans had just left, maybe they'd packed up and gone home. Hans didn't believe that, but he wanted to. They came over a ridge and saw it, a supply depot, American. It sat in a clearing below them, half hidden by trees. Rows of canvas-covered trucks, stacks of wooden crates, a few tents, their tops heavy with snow. No movement, no smoke from fires, no guards. They ran, someone said behind him. Hans didn't answer. He started down the hill. The depot was bigger than it looked from above, crates everywhere, fuel drums lined up in rows, boxes stamped with English words Hans couldn't read. The Americans had left in a hurry. Tent flaps hung open, papers blew across the snow. A coffee pot sat on a table, frozen solid. Hans's hands shook as he pulled open the first crate. Inside, cans, dozens of them, meat, vegetables, peaches. He grabbed one and turned it over in his hands like he didn't believe it was real. Around him, the other men were opening crates too. Someone laughed. Someone else started crying. Hans didn't look at them. He just held the can and tried to remember the last time he'd seen fruit. "There's more," a voice called from the next tent. Hans walked over. Inside, stacked on wooden pallets, were boxes, smaller ones, cardboard, not wood. The man who'd called out was holding one, staring at it. "What is it?" Hans asked. The man didn't answer. He just opened the box. Inside was a cake. Chocolate, fresh, still soft when the man pressed his finger against it. The smell hit Hans like a punch. Sweet, rich, real. Not the sawdust bread they'd been eating for months. Not the thin soup that was mostly water. Actual cake. How? Someone whispered. Hans didn't know. None of them did. They stood there in the tent, surrounded by boxes of cake, and nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Someone finally tore a piece off and ate it. Then another man did. Then all of them. Hans took a piece and put it in his mouth and closed his eyes. It tasted like something from a different life. A life where people had enough. Where the war wasn't everywhere. Where you didn't wake up thinking about food before you thought about anything else. "They sent this across the ocean," a man said quietly, "from America." Hans opened his eyes. The man was holding the box, looking at the label. English words, American stamps. "They sent cake," the man said again, "across the Atlantic, while we're eating bread made from wood." Nobody answered. There was nothing to say. Hans looked around the tent, at the crates, at the men eating with their hands, their faces blank, at the boxes and boxes of cake stacked higher than his head, enough to feed a battalion, enough to feed more. And somewhere in the back of his mind a thought formed, slow and cold and heavy. If the Americans could send cake across an ocean while fighting a war on 2 continents, what did that mean? What did it say about who was winning? What did it say about who was going to lose? Hans put the cake down. He wasn't hungry anymore. Around him, men kept eating, but the sound in the tent wasn't happy. It wasn't relief. It was something else, something quieter, something that felt like the end of something. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow started falling again. And in the forest, far away, the artillery kept going. Hans walked out of the tent. The cold hit his face, but he barely felt it. Behind him, men were still opening boxes, still eating, still trying to understand what they'd found. He moved between the rows of supplies, looking at everything now, really looking. There were crates of cigarettes, American brands, dozens of cartons in each box, stacks of wool blankets, clean and thick, medical supplies in white boxes with red crosses, chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper, coffee, real coffee, not the burnt grain they'd been drinking since 1942. A private named Werner came up beside him. He was holding a can of condensed milk. "Look at this," Werner said. His voice was flat. "Milk. They have milk." Hans took the can. It was heavy, full. The label showed a cow and a farm, and words in English that probably said something about freshness or quality or how good it tasted. "We haven't had milk in 2 years," Werner said. "My daughter doesn't remember what it tastes like." Hans handed the can back. He didn't want to hold it anymore. They kept walking, past more crates, past a truck with its engine still warm. The Americans had left recently, maybe an hour ago. Past boxes of ammunition stacked so high they made walls. Past drums of gasoline. Past everything. And slowly, as Hans walked, something broke inside him. Not all at once, just a crack, small at first, then bigger. He'd believed in the war once. Not at the start maybe, but later. After France fell, after the victories kept coming, after it seemed like Germany might actually win. He'd believed because he had to, because everyone around him believed, because the alternative was too big to think about. But standing here, in this American supply depot in the middle of nowhere, looking at cake and milk and cigarettes sent from a country thousands miles away, he couldn't believe anymore. Germany was starving, the cities were rubble, the factories were running on nothing. People were eating bread made from sawdust and potatoes that were half rotten. Children were thin, old people were dying, and the government kept saying they were winning. But the Americans had cake. Werner was opening another crate now. He pulled out something wrapped in waxed paper and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a sandwich, pre-made, cheese and meat on white bread. It looked fresh. "They made sandwiches," Werner said quietly, "and they sent them here, to soldiers, in the field." Hans watched him hold the sandwich, watched him turn it over like he was trying to figure out how it was possible. "We can't even make bread," Werner said, "and they're sending sandwiches." Other men were coming out of the tents now, all of them holding something, all of them with the same look on their faces. Not happy, not grateful, just empty. A sergeant named Coach walked up. He was older than most of them, maybe 40. He'd fought in the First War too. He knew what losing looked like. "Pack what you can carry," Coach said. "We move in 10 minutes." Nobody moved. "Did you hear me?" Coach said. "Yes," Hans said, but he didn't move either. Coach looked at him, then at the others, then at the supplies spread out across the clearing. He was quiet for a long time. "We're not going to win this," Coach said finally. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Are we?" Nobody answered, but they all knew. Hans thought about home, about his mother's letters, the ones that came less and less often, about the ration cards that didn't buy anything anymore, about his brother, who died at Stalingrad and who everyone said had died a hero, but who Hans knew had just died cold and hungry in a city that didn't matter. He thought about all the speeches, all the promises, all the talk about final victory and secret weapons, and how Germany would never surrender. And he thought about cake, fresh chocolate cake, sent across an ocean, while German soldiers ate bark soup and pretended it was enough. Werner sat down in the snow. He was still holding the sandwich. He hadn't eaten it. He just held it and stared at nothing. "My daughter asked me in her last letter when the war would end," Werner said. "I told her soon. I told her we were winning." He looked up at Hans. "I lied to her." Hans didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Around them, men were packing supplies into their bags and their pockets and their coats, taking what they could. But their movements were slow, mechanical, like they were already somewhere else. Coach checked his watch. "Time to move," he said. They left the depot the way they'd come, walking back up the ridge into the trees. Hans looked back once, at the tents, at the crates they couldn't carry, at the supplies that would still be there when the Americans came back. Because the Americans would come back. They always did. They had more men, more tanks, more planes, more everything. And they had cake. The thought sat in Hans's chest like a stone as they walked, heavy and cold and impossible to ignore. Somewhere ahead, the war was still happening. Orders were still being given. Men were still dying for ground that didn't matter. But Hans knew now. They all knew. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were just fighting to not lose for one more day. They walked north through the forest, 12 men in a line, quiet except for the sound of their boots in the snow. Hans was near the front. Werner was behind him. Coach led them, checking his compass every few minutes, saying nothing. The weight in Hans's pack felt wrong. Not heavy, he'd carried heavier, but wrong. Inside were cans of American meat, chocolate bars,
A pack of cigarettes he didn't smoke but took anyway. Things that shouldn't exist. Not here, not in this war. Around him, the other men carried the same, bulging packs, full pockets. One man had stuffed condensed milk cans into his coat until he looked twice his size. Nobody talked about it. Nobody said what they were all thinking. They walked for an hour before they heard the guns again. Artillery, far off to the west. The sound rolled through the trees like thunder that wouldn't stop. It was their artillery, German guns, firing at American positions somewhere past the ridge. Hans tried to feel something about that. Pride, maybe? Or hope? But all he felt was tired. Werner came up beside him. "You think they know?" he asked quietly. "Who?" "The officers, the generals, Hitler?" Werner shifted his pack. "You think they know what we just saw?" Hans thought about that. About the men in Berlin giving orders. About the speeches on the radio. About all the talk of secret weapons and final victory, and how Germany would never break. "Maybe," Hans said. "Maybe they know. And they're still telling us to fight?" Hans didn't answer. They walked past a burned-out American Jeep, flipped on its side. The metal was black. The tires were gone. It had been there for days, maybe longer. Just another piece of wreckage in a forest full of wreckage. A young soldier named Dieter stopped next to it.
He was 19. He'd been in the army for 4 months. "Sergeant," Dieter said, "can I ask something?" Coach stopped, turned around. "What? Why are we still fighting?" The words hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Coach looked at Dieter for a long time. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Something small and sad and old. "Because those are our orders," Coach said finally. "But those are our orders," Coach said again, harder this time. "We follow orders. That's what soldiers do." Dieter nodded slowly, but Hans could see it in his face. The same thing that was in all their faces now. The question that wouldn't go away. What's the point? They started walking again. The snow got heavier. The wind picked up. Hans pulled his collar tight and kept his head down and tried not to think about the depot, about the cake, about what it meant. But he couldn't stop, because it wasn't just the cake. It was everything. The cigarettes, the milk, the fresh bread, the trucks that ran, the gasoline that wasn't watered down, the supplies that kept coming and coming and coming, like the Americans had so much they didn't know what to do with it all. Germany didn't have that. Germany had barely enough to keep the army moving. The cities were bombed every night. The trains didn't run on time. The factories were out of steel. People were burning furniture to stay warm. And still, the radio said they were winning. Hans thought about his last leave. 3 weeks ago, he'd gone home to Stuttgart for 5 days. The city was half gone. Buildings collapsed into the streets. Rubble everywhere. His mother lived in the basement of their old apartment building because the top floors didn't exist anymore. She'd made him dinner the first night, potato soup, thin, no meat, no butter, just potatoes and water and salt. "It's good," he'd told her. She'd smiled, but her hands shook when she poured it. On his last day, she'd walked him to the train station. She didn't cry. She just held his hand and told him to be safe. And when the train started moving, she'd stood on the platform and waved until he couldn't see her anymore. Hans wondered if he'd ever see her again. "Stop," Coach said suddenly. Everyone stopped. Hans looked up. Ahead, through the trees, he could see smoke, black smoke, rising in thin columns. "What is it?" Werner asked. Coach didn't answer. He moved forward slowly, and they followed. The village appeared through the snow. Small, maybe 20 houses, or what used to be houses. Now it was just walls and chimneys and smoke. Everything else was gone. They walked into the center of the village, past burned buildings, past a church with no roof, past a well that had frozen over. There were no people. "Americans?" someone asked. "No," Coach said quietly. "Us." Hans looked around. He saw the marks. Shell craters from German artillery. Tank tracks in the mud, frozen now. Bullet holes in walls, grouped tight. Machine gun fire, controlled and aimed. The village had been in the way, so they'd destroyed it. Hans walked to what used to be a house. The walls were black. The roof was gone. Inside, he could see the shape of furniture, a table, chairs, all of it burned. He thought about the people who lived here, where they went, if they got out, if they were alive. He thought about the American soldiers at the depot who had chocolate cake,
And he thought about this village, destroyed because it was in the path of an army that was losing. Werner came up beside him. He wasn't holding anything anymore. He'd dropped his pack somewhere. His hands were empty. "I want to go home," Werner said quietly. Hans nodded. "Me too." "Not after the war," Werner said. "Now, today. I want to walk away and go home and see my daughter before—" He stopped, didn't finish. Before what? Before she forgets me? Before the bombs come? Before it's too late? Hans didn't ask. He already knew. Coach called them back. They formed up again and kept walking, north, toward their lines, toward the war that wouldn't end anymore. And as they walked, Hans felt it again, that crack inside him, getting bigger, spreading. He'd eaten American cake in a captured depot. He'd seen what the enemy had. He'd walked through a village his own army destroyed. And he knew, in a way he couldn't unknow, that this was already over. They just hadn't admitted it yet. They reached their own lines just after dark, a cluster of foxholes dug into a hillside, covered with branches and snow. 30 men, maybe less, hard to tell in the dark. A lieutenant Hans didn't recognize came out to meet them. "Where have you been?" the lieutenant asked Coach. "Patrol," Coach said. "We found an American depot, took what we could." The lieutenant looked at their packs, at the bulges in their coats. His face didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes, something that looked like hunger. "Did you bring anything back for the company?" Coach reached into his pack and pulled out 3 cans of meat. He handed them over. The lieutenant took them without a word and walked back toward the command post. The men spread out, finding spaces in the foxholes, dropping their packs. Nobody talked much. They just sat and waited for orders that would probably come in the morning. Hans found a spot near the edge of the position. The foxhole was shallow, barely deep enough to sit in. Someone had tried to cover it with pine branches, but the snow had knocked most of them down. He sat with his back against the frozen dirt and closed his eyes. He could hear Werner a few feet away, opening a can of something, the metal scraping.
Then quiet chewing. Then nothing. Hans opened his own pack. He pulled out a chocolate bar and held it in his hands. The wrapper was brown and waxy, American letters he couldn't read. He broke off a piece and put it in his mouth. It tasted the same as it had in the depot. Sweet, rich, wrong. "Hey," Hans looked up. A soldier he didn't know was crouched next to the foxhole. Young, maybe 18. His uniform was too big for him. "Is it true?" the soldier asked. "What they're saying? What are they saying? That you found American supplies? That they had real food?" Hans held up the chocolate bar. The soldier stared at it, his mouth opened slightly. "Can I—" Hans broke off a piece and handed it over. The soldier took it carefully, like it might break, and ate it in one bite. He closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Hans nodded. The soldier stayed there for a moment, then walked back to his position. Around the hillside, Hans could hear other men talking, quiet voices in the dark. He caught pieces of it. "Sent from America. Chocolate cake. How do they have so much? We're eating nothing." The story was spreading, fast. By morning, everyone would know, and they'd all be thinking the same thing Hans was thinking now. Werner came over and sat down next to him. He had a can of peaches open. He ate slowly, like he was trying to make it last. "I've been thinking," Werner said after a while. "About what?" "About surrendering." Hans looked at him. Werner was staring at the can in his hands. "If we see Americans again," Werner said, "I'm thinking about just putting my hands up, walking over, giving up. They'll shoot you. Maybe. Or maybe they'll give me more cake." Werner's voice was flat, no joke in it, no smile. "At least I'd be alive. At least I'd eat." Hans didn't say anything, because part of him had been thinking the same thing. Not out loud, not in words, but the thought was there, sitting in the back of his mind, like something he wasn't ready to look at yet. "You think the others feel the same?" Werner asked. Hans looked around the hillside, at the shapes of men in foxholes, at the way they moved, slowly, like they were already ghosts, at the empty spaces where men used to be. "Yeah," Hans said, "I think they do." Werner finished the peaches and set the can down. "My daughter's name is Anna," he said quietly. "She's 6. She has blonde hair. She likes to draw pictures of horses." Hans didn't ask why Werner was telling him this. He already knew. Because if Werner didn't make it back, he wanted someone to remember. He wanted someone to know she existed. "She sounds nice," Hans said. "She is." Werner was quiet for a moment. "I haven't seen her in 8 months." The wind picked up. Snow started falling again, light and steady.
Hans pulled his coat tighter and watched it come down. Somewhere in the distance, he heard engines, trucks maybe, or tanks, hard to tell. The sound came and went with the wind. Do you think we'll die here? Werner asked. Hans thought about that, about the Americans with their supplies and their numbers and their chocolate cake, about the German army, starving and broken and still being told to fight, about how this story always ended. Probably, Hans said. Werner nodded slowly. Yeah, probably. They sat in silence for a while. The snow kept falling. The wind kept blowing. And somewhere out there, in the dark, the Americans were coming. Hans ate another piece of chocolate. It didn't taste like anything anymore. Just sweet. Just empty. He thought about the depot, about the crates of food they'd left behind, about the cake and the milk and the cigarettes and all of it. He thought about the village they'd walked through, about his mother in Stuttgart, about Werner's daughter drawing horses. And he thought about what Koch had said. We follow orders. That's what soldiers do. But what if the orders didn't make sense? What if the war was already lost? What if every day they kept fighting was just one more day of dying for nothing? Hans looked at Werner. If you surrender, he said quietly, I won't stop you. Werner looked back at him. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying, just tired, just done. Thanks, Werner said. The lieutenant came around an hour later. He stopped at each foxhole, giving orders for the morning. When he got to Hans, he crouched down. We're moving at dawn, the lieutenant said. East. There's an American column coming up the road. We're going to hit them. How many? Hans asked. Does it matter? Hans didn't answer. The lieutenant looked at him for a long moment, then at Werner, then at the empty chocolate wrapper on the ground. Get some sleep, the lieutenant said. He walked away. Hans leaned back against the frozen dirt. He closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep, because he knew what was coming. They all did. In the morning, they'd get their orders. They'd move out, they'd find the Americans, and they'd fight. And some of them would die. Maybe all of them. For what? For Germany? For Hitler? For the war? No, for nothing. Hans opened his eyes and looked up at the sky. The snow was falling heavier now, thick and white and endless. He thought about the cake one more time, about how strange it was, how impossible, how it changed everything just by existing. And he realized something. It wasn't just food. It was proof. Proof that the other side had already won. Proof that Germany couldn't keep going. Proof that every speech and every promise and every order to keep fighting was just a lie. The Americans had cake, and Germany had nothing left.
Hans didn't sleep. He sat in the foxhole and watched the snow fall and waited for the sun to come up. Around him, other men did the same. Nobody talked. Nobody moved much. They just waited. At some point, Werner fell asleep sitting up, his head against the side of the foxhole. His breathing was slow and even. Hans didn't wake him, let him have a few more hours of not knowing what was coming. The sky started to lighten around 6, gray at first, then pale blue. The snow had stopped. Everything was quiet. Koch came around at 6:30. He moved from foxhole to foxhole, shaking men awake, giving quiet orders. When he reached Hans, he stopped. You didn't sleep, Coach said. It wasn't a question. No. Coach nodded. He looked older in the morning light, tired. His face was gray. Wake him up, Coach said, pointing at Werner. We move in 20 minutes. Hans shook Werner's shoulder. Werner opened his eyes slowly, confused for a moment. Then he remembered where he was, what was happening. His face went flat. Already? Werner asked. Yeah. Werner sat up and rubbed his face with both hands. I was dreaming about home, he said quietly. Anna was there. She was showing me a picture she drew. Hans didn't say anything. Werner picked up his rifle, checked it, put it back down. Do you think we'll make it through today? Hans looked at him, at this man who had a daughter who drew horses, who ate American peaches last night like they were the last thing he'd ever taste. I don't know, Hans said. Werner nodded. Me neither. They climbed out of the foxhole. Around them, other men were doing the same, moving slowly, checking weapons, adjusting packs. Nobody looked ready. Nobody looked like they wanted to fight. The lieutenant gathered them in a clearing, 32 men total. That's all that was left of the company. 32, when there used to be over 100. Listen up, the lieutenant said. His voice was flat, professional, like he was reading from a script. Intelligence says there's an American supply column moving up the road 3 kilometers east of here. Trucks, maybe some armor.
We're going to hit them, take what we can, and fall back. Nobody said anything. Questions? The lieutenant asked. A corporal raised his hand. How many Americans? Unknown. What kind of armor? Unknown. Air support? Probably. The lieutenant looked around at all of them. But we have our orders, so we go. Hans felt Werner shift next to him, felt the tension in the air, felt all of them thinking the same thing. This is suicide. But nobody said it, because what would be the point? They moved out at 7, single file through the forest, east, toward the road. The sun was up now, bright and cold. The snow made everything too loud. Every step crunched. Every branch that broke sounded like a gunshot. Hans was in the middle of the line. Werner was behind him. Koch was up front with the lieutenant. They walked for 40 minutes without seeing anything, just trees and snow and the occasional frozen stream. Then they heard it. Engines. The lieutenant raised his hand. Everyone stopped. The sound was close, maybe half a kilometer. Trucks, definitely. Multiple vehicles, moving slow. The lieutenant motioned them forward. They moved off the path, spreading out through the trees. Hans found a position behind a fallen log. Werner was 10 feet to his left. He could see Koch further up, crouched behind a boulder. The sound got louder, closer. Hans checked his rifle, loaded, ready. His hands weren't shaking. He thought they would be, but they weren't. He just felt empty, hollow, like he was watching himself from somewhere else. The first truck came around the bend, American, olive green, canvas cover over the back, moving maybe 15 kilometers an hour, slow, careful. Then another truck, then another, 5 total. No tanks, no armor, just trucks. Hans waited, listening, watching. The lieutenant didn't give the order to fire. The trucks kept coming, 30 meters away now, 20. Hans could see the drivers through the windshields, young men, American uniforms. One of them was smoking a cigarette. Still no order. 10 meters. Hans looked over at Werner. Werner was staring at the trucks. His rifle was up, but he wasn't aiming. He was just staring. 5 meters. The lead truck passed right in front of them. So close, Hans could see the mud on the tires, could see the wooden crates in the back, could see the faces of the soldiers sitting inside, talking to each other, not knowing they were being watched. And the lieutenant still didn't give the order. The trucks kept going, all 5 of them, rolling past the German positions like they were ghosts, like they weren't even there. Hans watched them disappear around the next bend, listened to the engines fade, waited for someone to say something. Nobody did. After a long moment, the lieutenant stood up. He didn't look at any of them. He just started walking back the way they'd come. "What are we doing?" a voice called out. It was Dieter, the young one. "Sir, what are we doing?" The lieutenant stopped, turned around. His face was blank. "Going back," he said. "But the trucks—" "Going back," the lieutenant said again, louder this time. "That's the order. We're going back." Dieter stared at him. "We're just letting them go?" The lieutenant didn't answer. He turned and kept walking. Slowly, the men got up, started following. Nobody talked, nobody asked questions. They just walked. Hans fell in line. Werner came up beside him. "He didn't order us to fire," Werner said quietly. "No. Why?" Hans thought about that, about the lieutenant's face, about the way he'd watched those trucks roll past, about the way his hands had been clenched at his sides. "Because he knows," Hans said. "Knows what?" Werner was quiet for a moment.
Then he nodded. Yeah, it doesn't. They walked back to the hillside in silence. When they got there, the lieutenant dismissed them. No explanation, no orders for tomorrow. He just walked to the command post and went inside. Hans sat down in his foxhole. He put his rifle next to him and stared at nothing. Around him, men were doing the same. Sitting, waiting, not talking. Because what was there to say? They'd been sent to attack a convoy. They'd watched it pass. They'd done nothing. And nobody had questioned it. Nobody had complained. Because they all knew. The war was over. They just hadn't been told yet. Hans reached into his pack and pulled out the last piece of chocolate. He looked at it for a long time. Then he broke it in half and gave one piece to Werner. They ate in silence. The chocolate tasted like surrender. 3 days passed, then 4, then 5. No orders came. The men stayed on the hillside. They ate what they'd taken from the depot. They sat in their foxholes. They waited. Every morning, someone asked Koch what they were supposed to do. Every morning, Koch said he didn't know. The lieutenant stayed in the command post. Hans saw him once, standing in the doorway, looking west toward where the American lines were. He stood there for maybe 10 minutes. Then he went back inside. On the 6th day, Werner stopped eating. Hans noticed it at breakfast. Werner sat with his back against the foxhole, staring at a can of meat in his hands. He didn't open it. He just held it. "You should eat," Hans said. Werner didn't answer. "Werner." "I can't." Werner's voice was quiet, flat. "Every time I try, I just think about Anna, about what she's eating, about what my wife is eating, and I can't." He set the can down and pushed it toward Hans. "You have it." Hans looked at the can, then at Werner. Werner's face was thin. His eyes were hollow. He looked like he'd already died and just hadn't stopped moving yet. "You need to eat," Hans said. "No, I don't." Werner leaned his head back. "None of us do. We're not going anywhere. We're not fighting anymore. We're just sitting here, waiting for it to end." Hans didn't argue, because Werner was right. That afternoon, Koch gathered everyone together, all 32 men. They stood in a rough circle in the snow. "I got word from battalion," Koch said. "The offensive is over. We're pulling back." Nobody reacted. Nobody looked surprised. "When?" someone asked. "Tonight. We move at midnight." "Where are we going?" "East, back toward Germany." The word hung in the air. Germany. Home. It should have meant something. Should have felt like relief. But it didn't. It just felt like the end. "What about the Americans?" Dieter asked. Koch shook his head. "They're everywhere. We avoid them if we can. If we can't..." He didn't finish. Nobody asked him to. They broke up after that, went back to their positions, started packing what little they had. Hans rolled up his blanket, checked his rifle one more time, put the last can of food in his pack. Werner still hadn't moved. He sat in the foxhole with his hands in his lap, staring at nothing. "We're leaving tonight," Hans said. Werner nodded slowly. "Okay. You need to pack." "Okay." But Werner didn't move. Hans packed for him, rolled up his blanket, put his things in his pack. Werner just sat there. At 11:30, they formed up, a long line of men in the dark. No lights, no talking, just shadows moving through snow. The lieutenant led them east. Koch was at the back, making sure nobody fell behind. Hans was near the middle. Werner was next to him, walking like a machine, step after step after step. No thought behind it, just movement. They walked for 2 hours before they heard the planes. High up, American bombers, probably, heading somewhere else. The sound rolled across the sky like distant thunder. Hans looked up, but couldn't see anything. Just black. One of the men started crying. Quiet at first, then louder. The lieutenant turned around. "Keep it together," he said. The man kept crying. Nobody stopped him. They reached a village around 3 in the morning. Small, dark, maybe abandoned, maybe not. Hard to tell. The lieutenant told them to rest for 20 minutes. Hans sat down on the steps of a building. Werner sat next to him. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say anymore. Across the street, 2 soldiers were arguing in whispers. Hans couldn't hear all of it. Just pieces. "Should just give up. They'll shoot us. Better than this." One of them stormed off. The other sat down and put his head in his hands. Hans thought about the chocolate cake again, about the depot, about how that moment had broken something in all of them, something that couldn't be fixed. It wasn't just seeing the supplies. It was understanding what they meant. It was knowing, in a way you couldn't unknow, that the other side had already won, that everything from here on out was just waiting for the official announcement. They'd been lied to, for months, maybe years, told that Germany was strong, that victory was coming, that sacrifice mattered. But the Americans had cake, fresh cake, sent across an ocean, while German soldiers ate soup made from bark. The lie was too big to ignore now. Werner spoke suddenly. His voice was so quiet Hans almost didn't hear him. "I'm not going back." Hans looked at him. "What?" "To Germany. I'm not going back." "Where are you going to go?" Werner was quiet for a long time. "I'm going to surrender. Tomorrow. Next time we see Americans. I'm walking over with my hands up." Hans didn't try to talk him out of it. A week ago, maybe. But not now. "They might shoot you," Hans said. Maybe, or maybe they'll put me in a camp, feed me, keep me alive until this is over, and then I can go home, to Anna. You really think that? Werner looked to him. No, but it's better than this. The lieutenant called them back into formation. They kept walking, east, toward Germany, toward the end. By dawn, they'd covered maybe 15 kilometers. Not far, but enough. They found another village, another cluster of empty buildings. The lieutenant let them rest. Hans found a barn and collapsed in the hay. Werner was next to him. Around them, other men did the same, falling into sleep like drowning. Hans closed his eyes. He thought about home, about Stuttgart, about his mother in that basement, waiting for a son who might not come back. He thought about the war ending, about what would happen after, about whether there would even be a Germany left to go back to. He thought about surrender, about walking over to the American lines with his hands up, about how easy it would be, how simple. And for the first time since the depot, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt fear, not of dying. He'd stopped being afraid of that months ago. Fear that Werner was right, that surrender was the only choice left, that fighting was just another word for dying slowly. Fear that he'd already made his decision, he just hadn't admitted it yet. Hans opened his eyes and stared at the roof of the barn. Morning light came through the cracks in the wood, thin lines of gold in the darkness. Outside, he could hear someone talking, Koch maybe, giving orders, organizing the next march. But Hans didn't get up. He just lay there, thinking, waiting, wondering if he'd ever see his mother again, wondering if any of them would make it home. They stayed in the barn until afternoon. Nobody came to move them. Nobody gave orders. The lieutenant had disappeared into one of the houses. Koch sat outside, smoking a cigarette he'd gotten from the American supplies. He didn't talk to anyone. Hans watched men around him. Some slept, some sat and stared. One man was writing a letter on a piece of torn paper, but he kept stopping, starting over, crossing things out. Finally, he crumpled it up and threw it away. Werner hadn't moved in hours. He lay in the hay with his eyes open, looking at nothing. Werner, Hans said quietly. No answer. You should drink something. Werner blinked slowly. I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. None of them were. Around 2 o'clock, Dieter came running into the barn. His face was white. They're coming, he said. Everyone sat up. Who? Koch was already on his feet, moving toward the door. Americans, tanks, coming up the road from the west. The barn went silent. Koch looked around at all of them. 32 men. Tired, hungry, broken. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. What were the orders supposed to be? Fight? Run? Hide? How far? Koch asked finally. Maybe a kilometer, maybe less. Koch looked at the lieutenant's house, then back at the men, then at the ground. Get your things, he said quietly. We're moving. Nobody moved. Did you hear me? Where are we supposed to go? Someone asked. Hans didn't see who. Koch didn't answer right away. He just stood there, rifle in his hands, looking at men who weren't soldiers anymore, who'd stopped being soldiers the moment they found that depot, who were just people now, trying not to die. East, Koch said finally. We keep going east. Into what? The voice again. More Americans? More orders that don't mean anything? More days of walking until we drop? Koch's face went hard. We follow orders. That's what soldiers do, the voice finished. I know, you keep saying that. Hans turned. It was Werner. He was sitting up now, looking at Koch with empty eyes. But we're not soldiers anymore, Werner said. Are we? Koch stared at him. We're just men, Werner continued. His voice was soft, calm, like he was explaining something obvious. Men who are going to die if we keep doing this. Men who have families, who want to go home, who are tired of pretending any of this matters. Shut up, Koch said. No. Werner stood up slowly. You know I'm right. You all know I'm right. We lost. It's over. And we're still walking around like there's something to fight for. I said shut up. Werner took a step forward. What are you going to do, Sergeant? Shoot me? Go ahead. Save the Americans the trouble. Koch's hands were shaking. He looked around at the other men, at their faces, at the way they were all watching Werner. Not with anger, not with disagreement, with understanding. You're a coward, Koch said quietly. Werner nodded. Maybe, but I'm a coward who wants to see his daughter again. He turned and walked toward the door. Hans stood up. Where are you going? Hans asked. Werner stopped, looked back. West, toward the Americans. I'm done. They'll shoot you. Maybe, or maybe they'll capture me, put me in a camp, feed me.
And when this is over, I'll go home. Werner's voice cracked slightly. At least I'll have tried. At least I won't die in a barn in the middle of nowhere for a war that's already lost. He looked around at all of them. Anyone want to come with me? Silence. Then a hand went up, the young soldier who'd asked Hans for chocolate. Then another hand, one of the older men from Cock's squad. Then another. Then 3 more. 7 men total. Cock's face went white. You're deserting. Yes, Werner said simply. I am. I'll have you shot. By who? Them? Werner pointed at the remaining men. They don't want to shoot me. They want to come with me. They're just too scared to admit it. Cock looked at Hans.
Say something. Hans looked at Werner, at the 7 men standing with him, at Coach, whose hands were still shaking, at the American tanks that were coming up the road. I don't know what to say, Hans said quietly. Coach's face fell, like something inside him had broken, like he'd been holding on to something for so long and had just realized it wasn't there anymore. Fine, Coach said. His voice was barely a whisper. Go, all of you. Run to the Americans. Beg them for mercy. See if they give it to you. Werner picked up his rifle. Then he set it down. He wasn't going to need it anymore. Goodbye, Hans, Werner said. Hans nodded. Goodbye. Werner walked out of the barn. The 7 men followed him. Hans watched them go. Watched them walk west, toward the sound of engines, toward the enemy, toward whatever came next. The barn was quiet. 24 men left now. 24 out of 100. Coach sat down slowly. He put his head in his hands. Nobody said anything. Dieter was standing by the door, watching Werner and the others disappear into the trees. Do you think they'll make it? He asked. I don't know, Hans said. Do you think we will? Hans looked around the barn, at the men who'd stayed, at Coach, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, at the rifles and packs and all the things that were supposed to matter but didn't anymore. No, Hans said, probably not. Dieter nodded. He looked like he might cry, but he didn't. He just stood there, holding his rifle, looking lost. Outside, the sound of engines got louder, closer. The lieutenant finally came out of the house. He walked to the barn and stopped in the doorway. He looked at what was left of the company, at the empty spaces where men used to be. Where's everyone else? He asked. Gone, Coach said without looking up. Gone where? West. They surrendered. The lieutenant's face went blank. He stared at Coach for a long moment. Then he looked at Hans, at Dieter, at all of them. We need to move, the lieutenant said finally. Why? Coach's voice was hollow. Where are we going to go? What's the point? The point, the lieutenant said slowly, is that we're still soldiers, and soldiers don't quit. Maybe they should, Coach said. The lieutenant opened his mouth, closed it. He looked older suddenly, tired, like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long and had just realized he couldn't carry it anymore. Pack your things, he said quietly. We leave in 5 minutes. He walked away. The men started gathering their stuff, slow, mechanical. Nobody talked. Hans picked up his pack, checked his rifle, looked at the door where Werner had disappeared, and he wondered if Werner had been brave or cowardly, if surrender was giving up or just being smart, if there was even a difference anymore. He thought about the cake one last time, about how everything had changed in that moment, how they'd all seen the truth and couldn't unsee it. They'd lost. Germany had lost. The war was over. They just hadn't stopped fighting yet. Hans slung his pack over his shoulder and walked out of the barn. The sun was high now, bright, cold. To the west, he could hear the tanks getting closer. To the east, Germany waited. Home, whatever was left of it. And somewhere in between, Werner was walking toward the Americans with his hands up. Hans closed his eyes, took a breath, opened them again. Then he started walking. East, because that's what he was supposed to do. Because he didn't know what else to do. Because he was still a soldier, even if he didn't know why anymore.